June 1941. Adolf Hitler addressed his generals with total conviction. The Soviet Union, he believed, was a decaying edifice. "We only need to kick in the door," he declared, "and the whole rotten structure will collapse." Within 6 months, 775,000 German soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured. This wasn't a failure on the battlefield. This was a disaster born in the war room, a strategic fantasy built on racial hatred that refused to see the enemy clearly. Hitler didn't just lose a military campaign. He demonstrated that ideology untethered from reality isn't power, it's self-destruction. This is the story of how Nazi racism didn't merely corrupt Germany's moral standing. It annihilated their military strategy, transforming tactical excellence into a death warrant for 3 million men. December 18th, 1940. Hitler authorized Directive 21, the operational blueprint for Operation Barbarossa. The document didn't require rigorous strategic evaluation. It demanded belief, ideological conviction that the communist regime would crumble because racial destiny required it to crumble. And why would it crumble? Because Judeo-Bolshevik leadership was fundamentally weak. Because Slavic populations were racially subordinate. Because Aryan armies embodied historical inevitability. This wasn't rhetoric crafted for public consumption. This was actual military doctrine. The ideology of Lebensraum, or living space, dictated real combat objectives. Field marshals Walter von Brauchitsch, Franz Halder, and Wilhelm Keitel converted Hitler's racial delusions into operational directives. Seize Ukrainian agriculture, capture Caucasian petroleum, annihilate the Jewish Bolshevik menace. Career military professionals, officers educated in logistics and enemy assessment, became instruments of an ideological crusade that treated warfare as racial prophecy rather than a strategic problem. Franz Halder's war diary exposes what happened to disagreement. Internal discussions about Soviet territorial depth did occur. Senior officers like Gerd von Rundstedt and Fedor von Bock privately voiced concerns about the vast Russian interior. But questioning whether Soviet collapse would come quickly wasn't merely military caution. Within Hitler's chain of command, it constituted heresy. It suggested doubt in Nazi racial doctrine itself. So the reservations were suppressed, the objections were overruled, and the planning proceeded on a foundation of self-deception. The most damning proof lies in how intelligence was handled. The Abwehr and Fremde Heere Ost, that's Foreign Armies East, delivered precise tactical information. They counted Soviet formations. They monitored troop deployments. They mapped vulnerabilities in frontier positions. But when analysts attempted to assess the Soviet ability to regenerate losses, to activate reserves, and to maintain industrial output, ideology contaminated every finding. Soviet organizational competence was rejected as racially impossible. Why? Because intelligence officers couldn't envision Asiatic peoples under Jewish Bolshevik control matching German effectiveness. They didn't want to envision it, so they didn't. The tension was genuine. German military expertise versus Nazi ideological certainty. The distortion was institutional. Hitler's command circle reinforced racial dogma until contradictory intelligence assessments became career suicide. The corruption was total. What should have been disciplined military evaluation became ideologically contaminated fantasy. The catastrophe was guaranteed before any panzer crossed the frontier. But ideology doesn't win wars. Intelligence, logistics, and industrial might do. And on every metric, German planning was about to collide with a reality they refused to acknowledge. German intelligence analysts examined reports indicating Soviet tank quantities that defied possibility. Over 10,000 tanks concentrated in Western military districts alone. Their response wasn't to reconsider their assumptions. Type sound incredulous intensity low. It was to assume Soviet deception. Fremde Heere Ost had completed thorough work on deployments. They'd mapped Soviet unit positions. They'd catalogued tactical vulnerabilities. They'd accurately charted frontline dispositions. but they catastrophically misjudged strategic reserves and mobilization potential. Yes, the Soviets possessed over 10,000 tanks, but German analysts classified most of them as antiquated BT and T-26 variants, obsolete machines that would disintegrate against modern panzers. What they failed to comprehend was the manufacturing reality generating those figures. The Soviet Union could replace casualties faster than Germany could inflict them. The industrial capacity necessary for such replacement was deemed unachievable. Why? Because Nazi doctrine proclaimed the USSR a primitive Asiatic society. Type alarmed, intensity high. Then German tank crews encountered the T-34. It had a 76.2mm main gun and 45mm of angled armor that ricocheted German rounds like pebbles off steel. The KV-1 heavy tank proved even worse, 90mm of protection that German weapons couldn't breach at engagement distances. German Panzer IIIs mounted 37 to 50mm guns behind just 30mm of plate. The Panzer IV's 75mm cannon was short-barreled and low velocity, insufficient against Soviet steel. The technical dominance German strategists had assumed simply didn't exist. And worse, merely 3,350 German tanks confronted an adversary capable of mass-producing superior armor. Franz Halder's journal chronicles the nightmare materializing in real time. Soviet divisions the Wehrmacht had eliminated reappeared within days. Fresh armies emerged from the eastern depths. Formations German intelligence insisted were non-existent. Each entry reveals mounting alarm. Each report contradicts planning foundations. The enemy was supposed to be finished. Instead, they kept materializing. Reinhard Gehlen, commanding Fremde Heere Ost, supplied accurate intelligence on Soviet reserves. His assessments documented the scope of Soviet mobilization potential. But the High Command reinterpreted every data point to match their assumptions. Obsolete armor was irrelevant. Reserves must be finite. Soviet commanders must be incompetent. The contradiction was stark. Frontline intelligence personnel reported disturbing evidence that challenged leadership beliefs. The distortion was methodical. Every report passed through an ideological filter that reframed evidence to conform with Nazi racial theory. Intensity high. The result was catastrophic. By invasion day, German commanders believed their own mythology, producing a gap between expectation and actuality that no battlefield triumph could close. Meanwhile, Stalin committed his own symmetrical intelligence failure. Richard Sorge, a Soviet agent in Tokyo, transmitted exact warnings about invasion timing and magnitude. Additional sources validated the intelligence. But Stalin rejected everything as British manipulation designed to engineer war between Germany and the USSR. Here's the essential distinction, though. Stalin's apparatus, despite its savagery and initial disarray, demonstrated a capacity for strategic recovery. The Soviet state could adapt. Hitler's inflexible ideology could not. When reality contradicted Nazi racial theory, Hitler chose theory. Every single time. German tanks advanced eastward that June morning carrying ammunition, fuel, and a lethal burden of assumptions. Assumptions that would expire long before their supplies. The German offensive covered up to 600 kilometers in the opening weeks. It was swift, overwhelming, and relentless. But it concealed a critical weakness. Supply arteries extended past operational limits. By July and August of 1941, Panzer Group Guderian reported having under 2 days of fuel remaining. 2 days. Elite armored formations, the cutting edge of the entire invasion, were running empty while still hundreds of kilometers from their targets. By autumn, daily supply deliveries collapsed to just 20 to 30% of requirements. Intensity or medium, 20 to 30%. The offensive was suffocating on its own logistics. The rail gauge disparity between German and Soviet track demanded laborious conversion. Every kilometer of progress generated choke points. Every victory pushed supply depots further from combat units. The rapid advance that resembled conquest was actually an elastic band approaching its breaking point. And here's the detail that demolishes the myth of German mechanization. Over 600,000 horses sustained Wehrmacht supply operations. 600,000 animals pulling cargo for the supposedly modern German military. The propaganda portrait of the fully motorized Wehrmacht was a fabrication. The material limitations were genuine, but ideology refused to recognize them. Meanwhile, the Soviets executed the largest industrial relocation in recorded history. Over 1,500 manufacturing facilities were dismantled under German aerial assault. Complete factories, tank assembly lines, aircraft production plants, and ammunition works were loaded onto railcars component by component. Laborers, machinery, and raw materials, everything was transported eastward under bombardment, then reconstructed beyond German reach in the Urals and Siberia. This was the organizational achievement German planners had dismissed as inconceivable for the inefficient Soviet bureaucracy. They were devastatingly mistaken. Soviet industrial commissars, names frequently unrecorded but collectively heroic, orchestrated this exodus while German ordnance detonated around them. Stalin's merciless prioritization of industrial evacuation over immediate military requirements proved strategically decisive. It was a calculation German racial bias prevented them from anticipating. German planners couldn't conceive that Slavic laborers and engineers could accomplish what Aryan industry could not. By late 1942, the verdict was irrefutable. Soviet tank and aircraft output surpassed Germany's. The nation Nazi racial theory dismissed as incapable of advanced manufacturing was outproducing the industrial heart of Europe. The USSR was constructing superior T-34 tanks and IL-2 Sturmovix faster than Germany could eliminate them. The greatest miscalculation wasn't about armor or railways, it was about human beings. The Germans had persuaded themselves they were attacking a collapsing edifice. They were about to learn they'd invaded a nation prepared to sacrifice everything. Initial German tactical superiority and Soviet disorder appeared to validate every premise. Millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled. The losses were staggering. Territory was abandoned. Wehrmacht newsreels displayed endless prisoner columns marching westward. Victory seemed predetermined. But the asymmetry that mattered was strategic, not tactical. By December 1941, German casualties totaled 775,000 killed, wounded, and missing, approximately 25% of the 3 million-man invasion force. These were losses Germany's constrained manpower reserves couldn't absorb in an extended campaign. Yet Soviet military casualties exceeded 4 million in 1941 alone, including 2.6 million prisoners. These were apocalyptic losses that should have guaranteed total disintegration by every German projection. Type: amazed, intensity, medium. Instead, the Soviets mobilized millions of fresh conscripts by autumn. The Red Army replaced casualties at rates German planners had judged impossible. Soviet mobilization capacity shattered every German forecast. For every Soviet soldier the Wehrmacht killed, 2 more materialized from the boundless East. The awakening unfolds in the diary of Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German infantryman with the 18th Division. His entries trace an arc from certainty through disbelief to despair. The Russian troops are completely broken, transforms into, "We have underestimated the Russians. We have underestimated their country." It's the personal odyssey of discovering his commanders had deceived him about the enemy and the war. Soviet war correspondent Vasily Grossman chronicled the opposing perspective. Terror evolving into fierce resolve among Red Army troops. He captured the psychological transformation from fighting for Stalin to fighting for existence. His notebooks record the human reality of Soviet resistance that German strategists never envisioned. The human character of Soviet defiance contradicted every Nazi assumption. When partisan fighter Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya faced execution by hanging, her final words crystallized national resistance. "You can't hang all 170 million of us." She grasped what Hitler's planners could not. The Soviet Union represented a population willing to suffer unthinkable hardship because they were fighting for survival, not territorial expansion. Her defiance was a mathematical rejection of German assumptions about Soviet morale and determination. Meanwhile, Georgy Zhukov personified Soviet strategic evolution from initial catastrophe to organized resistance to victorious counterattack. His operational mastery contradicted every German assumption about Soviet military leadership being inherently incompetent due to Judeo-Bolshevik corruption. By December 1941, the German advance halted before Moscow. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. German troops lacked winter gear because planners assumed the campaign would conclude before winter arrived. The assumption was wrong. The soldiers froze. The tension was existential. German troops experienced the chasm between what they'd been promised and what they confronted: inexhaustible Soviet reserves, superior armor, and murderous conditions. The pressure was unrelenting. Each final Soviet position revealed another defensive line, each destroyed. Formation was replaced. The T-34s kept coming. The transformation was psychological. The metamorphosis from conquerors to survivors. The recognition that they were trapped in an unwinnable war of attrition. Hitler's rotten structure proved to be their own strategic planning. The door Hitler promised to kick in had become a fortress wall, and behind it stood a nation that refused to become what Nazi ideology demanded it must be. In June 1941, Adolf Hitler stood at the zenith of his authority, commanding the most tactically skilled military on earth, convinced that racial destiny guaranteed his triumph. 18 months later, the German Sixth Army would be encircled at Stalingrad. The legend of Wehrmacht invincibility would be permanently destroyed. Operation Barbarossa didn't collapse because of Russian winter. It didn't collapse because of any single engagement. It collapsed in the planning chambers where ideology contaminated strategy. Every assumption that guided German planning proved catastrophically false. Slavic peoples were not inferior. The Soviet state was not a house of cards. Communist leadership was not incompetent. And Soviet industry was not backward. The Soviets mobilized more soldiers. They manufactured more armor. They relocated entire industries. They exhibited a capacity for systematic resistance that Nazi racism declared impossible. Franz Halder's diary recorded the evidence. Wilhelm Hoffmann's letters captured the disillusionment. Soviet production figures told the mathematical truth. The regenerating divisions proved the mobilization reality. Intensity, medium. All the evidence existed, but ideology is a potent narcotic, and the Nazis had overdosed on their own propaganda. The historical precedent should have served as warning. 129 years earlier, Napoleon's Grande Armée followed the identical road to identical catastrophe. Rapid advance, logistical overextension, underestimation of Russian strategic depth, and winter devastation. The lesson was available. German planners recognized it and dismissed it, because Nazi racial doctrine taught that Slavic peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of the resilience that annihilated Napoleon. Contemporary military institutions now cite Operation Barbarossa as the definitive example of strategic hubris. Not merely as tactical failure, but as warning about how contempt corrupts analysis. War colleges teach that racial or cultural arrogance isn't simply morally reprehensible, it's operationally disastrous. It poisons intelligence evaluation. It warps logistical planning. It generates strategic delusions that no measure of battlefield excellence can overcome. German generals numbered among history's finest tactical commanders. But they were executing an unwinnable war because ideology had predetermined their conclusions about Soviet vulnerability. Hitler kicked in the door expecting a decaying structure to crumble. Instead, he encountered 170 million people who refused to become what his ideology required them to be. And that refusal buried the Third Reich in the snow outside Moscow, in the devastation of Stalingrad, and ultimately in the ruins of Berlin itself. Barbarossa endures as history's definitive lesson. Intensity. Medium. Underestimate your enemy at your peril. but underestimate them because of racist contempt. And you don't merely lose battles. You lose everything. The Nazis didn't simply commit a military error. They demonstrated that ideology divorced from reality isn't strength, it's suicide. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week.